So as discussed earlier this week, we're going to have a presentation to sort of highlight and continue some of the work we've done about how unemployment and different aspects of the labor market are measured in the U.S. We talked about how specific to the U.S., but the general principles apply to most countries. And that for thinking about full employment, for thinking about policies, it's very important to have some sense of measurement, right? How do we assess what the problems are and how well we are solving them? Today, our presentation is by Tyler Emerson. Tyler is a graduate of the Mohr Economics undergraduate program. He was, I believe this is correct, in the first iteration of this course. Right? So back in the pandemic, when this was all online, Tyler was in that class. And has continued a lot of the research begin there. Also research that he did for his Josh project into disability and employment. He currently works for the Economic Democracy Initiative, OSUN NE. If you want to use all the acronyms. Over in Whitewood, which is where Tyler is based. One of the things that may come up in this presentation, it will certainly come up later in the course. Tyler was instrumental in creating a job guarantee website. So this is a new project that Eddie's been doing, a interactive website, not just a web page, that maps, programs, everything, survey of public employment programs around the world that we're going to use later in the course. So, man of many talents. Tyler's going to present here for a bit on some of his research, and then we've prepared some exercises to do. I see most of you have your laptops, so similar to what we did before. And we'll be using some of these measures that we talked about on Tuesday, as well as other metrics that we'll be explaining. So we'll just put these up here as a reference. With that, I guess I will turn it over to Tyler.
Hi everyone. Well, thank you for the introduction, Kyle. It was really covered it all. Yeah, I was really lucky to take this class when it was first offered, and it's exciting to be presenting to you all today. So I will just jump into it. So the key things that I want to convey to you all today. First is I'm really interested in disability, and so the first part of that is frameworks for understanding and interpreting disability, what that really means, and what we're talking about in social context and in an economic context as well. The next big part of the talk will be identifying barriers to full inclusion of people with disabilities in the labor force. And then lastly, I'll talk a bit about what I did for my SPROJ, which was qualitative long-form interviews with about 15 people who, different stages of life, but had self-identified as having disabilities, and what their experiences were like working or not being able to work over the course of their lives. And what that research I was interested in was the job guarantee literature didn't really discuss the disability question directly that often, and so what would a job guarantee mean for people with disabilities, basically? So first, just many of you may be familiar with this, but I just want to quickly go over those frameworks for understanding disability. So disability, in some sense, is a modern idea arising from capitalism and the reordering of society around capitalist modes of production. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, you had all these people in urban settings and working in industrial environments where people were getting injured all the time. Diseases were very common. So at the same time, the scientific movement was starting to catalog people and their experiences and describe anatomical differences and injuries and how to treat them. So what that really was describing was, normative ideas of function and functional limitations in the population. And then alongside that, especially through the 20th century, as medical technology got better, is an emphasis on rehabilitation and cure. So more recently, sociologists, legal rights scholars, and disability rights activists, the social model has sort of reinterpreted disability as an experience, and what they really focus on, they disambiguate impairment as a physical or psychological difference from the stigma associated with disability as an identity. And what that approach emphasizes is that first, that everyone is different. We have a normal distribution of variation across the human population. There's no like fully able-bodied human mind or body. And then secondly, how we organize our society, for example, the way our cities are structured or our rural areas are structured, how our factories are made, how our office buildings operate and look, can be the things that create barriers to full inclusion, not simply the functional limitations which we associate with a disability. And then just to sum it up a little bit, I think this is really important. In a sense, disability is universal. Basically everyone in the course of their lifespan, from birth to death, will have at least a temporary disability, experience disability. And if, in the rare case that doesn't happen, they'll have people around them who do. And then I think another important term here, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term. And what that really describes is that experiences of that stigma, not the physical differences, but the stigma really, and how you operate in society depends on your sex or gender, your age, your race and ethnicity, your class, and where you are in the world. And even religion, different religions conceive of disabilities very different ways. These are just a few themes I want you to be sort of floating around with today as I go through my lecture, and then as we go into the data exercise. First is, along with the rise of the scientific movement, and something we'll be partaking in today to some extent with our data exercises, tracking disability. So the US Census first, started asking about disability in the 1840s. Even earlier in some of the colonies, Massachusetts, for example, very early had sort of measures of disability in their data collection. And that's a way of understanding the health or the fitness or even the military readiness of a population. And then next, sort of alongside this is, medical advancements in healthcare and healthcare administration. And that's really shaped how people with disabilities and medical conditions have been able to participate or not in society. And then alongside this, and this to some extent goes along with our data today, is historically there was, quite an emphasis on segregation, institutionalization, which is, putting people with disabilities into medicalized, segregated environments. And we see here on the right, the image is from the School for the Feeble-Minded, which operated through, I believe, the 60s or early 70s in Massachusetts. And they were segregated. Often people were encouraged to give up their children at birth if they, had different disabilities. And they were used for medical tests as well. And as we can see, they're performing manual labor, so there's always this dichotomy. In these segregated environments, people would often sort of participate in manual labor, essentially, while being considered disabled or not able to work in a traditional sense. And more today, something I really want to think about in our data is wars and pandemics as visible and mass disabling events. So that really takes people who we might consider to be able-bodied or virtuous members of society in some sense. And then you have these events where people are taken out of normal society in some way or another. Long COVID is a great example of this today. FDR, who you've been talking a little bit about, he had polio, and then you have soldiers returning from wars who are also in service of their country, and then often excluded from society on the other end. And then importantly, what I'm really interested in is employment and workplaces as disabling spaces. That could be, lack of access to work. That could also be, here we have a factory, a cotton mill. People were being dismembered or injured all the time. And people still, even in an office setting, being sedentary can lead to health conditions or be disabling. And then at the same time, we have to recognize that unemployment and being excluded from parts of, everyday society can also be disabling in its own right. So we'll be thinking about both of those together in tandem, and it's a little bit complicated, but I think it's important to recognize that both are true. This is a major legal framework for thinking about disability today and civil rights in the context of disability, and this is after major activist efforts in the second half of the 20th century, building on the earlier Rehabilitation Act. And this really provides, and you probably know about this in an educational environment, but it applies to workplaces too, and transportation and public restrooms. Make sure that there's certain level of accommodations provided to people with disabilities. And that includes, like I said, government services, for example, which at one time were not accessible to people with disabilities. And then alongside this, I think just talking about work specifically, the key language is reasonable accommodations. And what that does include are things like accessible parking, modified tasks on the job, assistive software maybe, flexibility in breaks and schedules, work schedules. But at the same time, it does not include things like removing essential parts of the job or necessarily providing things that someone might need individually. And then another key thing that came up in my research talking with people with disabilities is ultimately this is something you negotiate directly with your employer or with your school. So in a sense, it's still a very socialized interaction, and the law is, what is a reasonable accommodation is not settled law, basically. It's always shifting. Is telework or is being streamed into all of your classes a reasonable accommodation? That's at the boundary of that question. Another key point, and we'll be thinking about this in the data exercise, is benefits and the benefits cliff. So people with disabilities have access to basic income, and that's SSI and SSDI. We can talk a little bit about the distinction. SSI is sort of everyone is entitled to it. SSDI is something you've paid into. It's a disability insurance. So when you're working, you're paying into a fund for that. And then there's healthcare benefits, there's food stamps, those sorts of things. The process is quite lengthy and difficult. They provide, relatively minimal income. People with disabilities in those programs are limited in what savings they can accrue. I think it's an asset limit of $2,000 in a bank account. And as a result of that, you have sort of funneling of people with disabilities on those benefits into lower wage jobs and less stable jobs. And then, of course, if you sort of have to prove that you can't work to join those benefits, and then if you just decide to work and then come back to them, it's a little harder to prove your case the second time around that you can't work. There are some programs, Ticket to Work and vocational rehabilitation on that, which try to incentivize people to rejoin the labor force. But it's complicated with the way the benefits are structured, and we'll be looking, carefully at that in the data today. So I won't get too technical about all this. There's some great formulas on the board for understanding some of these concepts, but I think in terms of employment, one thing that's so key is that paid work is really the key mode in the capitalist society that we live in for gaining social inclusion, status, and power. That's where a lot of movement happens in society. And with that in mind, people with disabilities are disproportionately not participating in the labor market. They're disproportionately unemployed. They're disproportionately underemployed, so not working as many hours as they would like to. They're disproportionately self-employed, so they're creating their own businesses. And then, like I said before, they're segregated into these lower wage occupations, service sector especially, which is more precarious. And then another phenomenon, which I don't know if you've heard of before, but is last in, first out. They're often fired, at the beginning of a recession, and then they're sort of on the tail end of the people who get rehired. So in a tight labor market, they're pulled in, but they don't maybe have they're not in the stable occupation so they can build up seniority in, so they get fired quickly as well. So let's show some graphs to illustrate this. So this is with a disability and with no disability, 16 years and over. So to some extent, we have to think this is including people over the retirement age. So maybe that skews it a little bit, but even if you're looking at just 16 to 65-year-olds, it's usually somewhere around 30% labor or employment population ratio. So that's how many people are employed over the whole population. So we see a really big disparity here. It's sort of speaks for itself, and we can also see, it's disproportionate, for the percent that are included in the labor market that get fired in recessions. We'll also notice that this uniform employment data only goes back to 2009. We'll look at data today that goes earlier than that, but this is monthly collected data. And then this is the unemployment rate, and we routinely see it's usually about twice as many, as a percent of the population, twice as many people that are unemployed. So want work, are looking for work, but are not able to find it. So, returning to that earlier point I made, I think it's really important to recognize that unemployment is disabling. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of really good sociological and medical research on the effects of being unemployed. Stress, depression and anxiety, the sedentism alongside that, which is accompanied by heart disease and stroke. Substance abuse is relatively common during the pandemic, for example. When people are disproportionately unemployed, alcohol consumption was at an all-time high. And then strained familial and community relationships. So all of this combined, especially in the long term, really is harmful to people's health. And then, just to make it clear, the majority of bankruptcies in the United States are caused by illness or disability. So this is really, really key to understanding how people fall through the cracks in society. So barriers to employment. There's a really great survey from the Kaiser Family Foundation done about 10 years ago. And it really just shows that people with disabilities do want to work. So some of the top factors that they cite, are not what you might expect. So first is lack of good jobs available. Second, lack of necessary skills or education for available jobs. Then we have family responsibilities, so taking care of kids or older members of their family. And then jobs being replaced by technology. I don't know about you, but this is not what I would really expect to read if you polled a group of 1,000 people with disabilities who are not participating, why they would say that they're not working. And then fifth on this list is discrimination. So perceived discrimination in hiring, which is also real and shown by research. So we'll turn quickly to the job guarantee. I know you're sort of early in your discussion of job guarantee proposals and everything like that, but I'm glad to get in there early because I think disability is so key to the job guarantee discussion. And first on that list is full employment just is not going to be possible without thinking about people with disabilities. Or if you achieve full employment without including them, you're creating a segregated society in some ways. And again, there's a lot of different surveys for this, but we just looked at a lot of those people with disabilities do want work. So that's really key because we don't want to be saying everyone has to work, but people with disabilities do want work. And then, with that in mind, what does full employment mean in the context of disability? Are we talking about everyone with disabilities being included in a job guarantee? I would say not. I think there are a lot of people who are not capable or shouldn't be working if they don't want to be. And then we'll look at our data investigation today, these people who are not participating and why they say they're not participating. So my research, like I said, I did this, long form interviews with people with disabilities, usually like an hour and a half or so. And what I was really trying to think about is a job guarantee. What would it mean for people with disabilities? And first on that is, what barriers exist for people with disabilities in the labor force in general, not just in the job guarantee. So So really getting from people like what is preventing you from working or makes it difficult for you to work if you are working. And then second is really, really key, which is, what are the risks of such a sweeping policy for people with disabilities? And then at the same time, what might the benefits be? And then finally, what with all that in mind, like what would you want in the policy to make sure that your job guarantee is not going to harm people with disabilities and is going to be the most beneficial it could possibly be? So the challenge is, I've sort of touched on them a little bit, but first is the danger of workfare, which you'll probably be thinking about to some extent in this class, which is people being compelled to work in order to receive benefits or to not lose benefits. And that's something we already see in some states, which again goes to this deserving or undeserving poor question. The next, the big challenge is sort of the contradictions of this disability employment paradigm and the benefits, which is, we don't have a lot of supports for people. The supports that do exist are quite minimal. And then there's sort of these perverse incentives to remain on them, and it's, quite difficult to, go back and forth, really experiment. You can't build up the savings that most people would want to take a risk on working if you're not sure what your work skills are really like. Next is just disability is such a huge topic. Like I said, it's universal. It's like kind of everyone that you're talking about in a sense over the course of their lifespan. And so how do you really keep all that in mind when you're creating a single policy that's supposed to like incorporate everyone if they want to join? And then another challenge is just like with all that in mind is really you don't want to be hurting an already marginalized and at-risk group of people. You really have to keep that in mind. So I think there's some major benefits, So I think of the job guarantee as being a potentially enabling policy, right? So that's getting around those social barriers that are preventing full employment, the stigma associated with disability, et cetera. So first, that's the true full employment, right? That's everyone who wants to work is able to work. And then next is for people with disabilities who are already working, dampening that cyclical unemployment, that first in, last in, first out phenomenon. So you'd be dampening that. And then next is the social inclusion dimension, which I talked about. It's such an important part of building social power, dignity for people. And then again, on top of that is sort of the enhanced democracy, and we're the Economic Democracy Initiative. That's what we're really big on, is this idea of economic democracy. And then next is setting a standard, and you'll talk about this with your job guarantee discussions, but if you're offering $15 an hour and benefits, it'll be hard for businesses to not offer that competitively. Then next, I think is important is improved public spaces and programs. With the input of people with disabilities, I think you could make a lot of public services and spaces more accessible, and I think there's a lot of projects that people with disabilities could be really essential in contributing to. And then I think protecting access to healthcare while working, that goes to that benefits cliff question. If there's benefits included in the work package, I think that does a lot to get rid of that fear. And then there's credentialing and building valuable experience on the job. Credentialing is not included in all of the job guarantee proposals, but it could be an important part of that. But building that experience on the job, that confidence is really important. And then lastly, I think in a more philosophical sense, is expanding the notion of work and getting away from just profit motive work, essentially. So I just want to return to this slide again, which is thinking about the job guarantee with these barriers in mind. I think first and foremost, we have the lack of good jobs available. I think that's something that the job guarantee is suited to address well, if it's administered well and you're creating good quality jobs. Then next is the lack of necessary skills or education. It goes to the credentialing and just on-the-job experience I was talking about. With family responsibilities, there's models of the job guarantee that include different sort of care work in them. So you might be alleviating some of those family care work responsibilities on individuals. Jobs replaced by technology. I think the job guarantee addresses that with the labor first focus. And then discrimination as well. You could administer a job guarantee in a way that would be less discriminatory than private sector employers. So on the job guarantee design, I know you're early in thinking about the components of a design, but but with disability, these were sort of the key recommendations that I come out of my thinking about job guarantee on, which is, finding ways to work around the benefits cliff, including insurance is a huge part of that. Health insurance is a huge part of that, like an expanded Medicaid or whatever the model might be. But next, I think you really need to be creating projects on the local level that keep the needs and skills of people with disabilities in mind. I think it's a program that it's a policy framework that's good for that. You can have job carving, for example, which is taking constituent parts, reducing multitasking, those sorts of things that make it more possible for people to contribute. Improving public spaces, like I said before, and making sure that the offices, however the job guarantee is structured, that people can get to the job. And then there's care work as part of that again. I think to make sure this all happens, you need a disability task force, at the design level. When it's in, the legislation is being drafted, you would want them to make sure the design and implementation is, crafted in a way that's keeping people with disabilities like in the discussion in the legislative sessions. And then next is, after the job guarantee is put in place in this hypothetical situation, you'd really want a civil rights division, which is monitoring, making sure, well, is this state or this locality not hiring people with disabilities at all? You would want to make sure that there's someone at the federal or at least the state level who's looking carefully at inclusion and making sure that that's happening. I think another important part is the adaptive technologies and accommodations. Setting that standard again, but making sure that you have those needs in mind when you're administering, and those technologies would be available to people. I talked about the public option for health insurance, which goes along the benefits cliff. And then some, you'll talk about this a little bit more, but some proposals for the job guarantee focus on it as a transitional employment option. That is to say, you provide a relatively low quality job or a time limited job that is supposed to be a springboard into private sector employment. I think in the context of people with disabilities, that's not desirable, both because of this benefits cliff question. And I also feel if the work that people are doing is publicly valuable, has social value to it, and the projects are valuable to society, why would you want to limit them to a 4-month period or something like that? And why would you want people to be kicked off? If they're doing valuable work, if it's valuable to society, I don't think there should be a direct incentive to move to the private sector. And I think that the higher quality of the job is, the more likely those people are to have skills that will be transferable to the private sector later, if that's your goal. So now I'm done with this part of the presentation. I want to open it up to questions and make sure I'm happy to field and answer as I can, and make sure that you understood and everything. And you're always welcome to email me again. But any questions? Yes.
Cool. Excuse me for my voice.
That's okay.
So how did you survey people? On which basis did you survey people that you surveyed? Was it like people in an organization or just
right? Yeah. So it was just basic public outreach. I know I did just some social media things, some like email blasts, and I'm trying to remember if I put something in the paper. But then I was also reaching out to organizations that serve people with disabilities, some in an employment context, and then some in just like an independence building context. So it wasn't this isn't a random survey or something like that, but I did get a pretty good, I had people from 18 years old to retirement age. So I had a pretty good survey in that sense, and then also a pretty good balance of some people who had never worked, some people who had worked for 20, 30 years and now were not working, some people who were just starting to think about how they could work with their disability in mind. So yeah, it was, to some extent it was interpersonal, like people would hear from other people that I was doing this and then were interested in talking about it. Like I said, basically everyone I talked to did want to work. Like people generally think of work as being where people build their identities and contribute to their communities. And it's not always clear what that means to those people and what they can do, but people were excited to talk about this subject, and and about like their life experiences generally. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
About what inclusion metrics look like for like civil rights divisions?
Right. That's a question. So that's a tough one. I would say that the job guarantee or public service employment programs around the world, sometimes you'll see that they have quotas, right? Quotas is one way of doing that. And they'll say at least 1% of our employed population needs to have a disability. I don't know that quotas, if you're thinking about a job guarantee or a right to employment as opposed to just a public service program, makes sense in achieving the full employment goal. I think you would want, that's where, I mean, I think it's where like the data that you're going to look at today and this discussion of what is full employment is really important. I would say, I don't want to put like a number on it, but it does seem, based on the fluctuations, that like many people with disabilities who are not participating are interested and able to work. So what I would say is you would want to look at the population, you know, as a percent. I would say you'd probably want a percent of the population, you know, to have good surveys on how many people in a given area are disabled, what types of disabilities they have, and you would want to at least come up with a ballpark of how many people you think could be included in a job guarantee. And I would say you could also, one thing, you know, basically you could do is, if there's an area that only has 1% of their participants with disabilities, and the average is 15% of participants, then that would be a pretty clear way of knowing. But I don't think the question of full employment in the context of people with disabilities is settled. I think it needs a lot more research, basically. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? I heard I might be hearing about UBI or something like that. I would love to hear a question about UBI in this context as well. Yes, please. Yeah.
You might talk a little bit
Yeah.
about, so on the first one, I know you've done some other research on policies like the ADA
Yeah.
stuff, and we talked a little about the importance of anti-discrimination laws in terms of employment, whether race, sex, gender, religion, but that, as important as they are in and of themselves, it doesn't necessarily guarantee there's sufficient jobs to address the unemployment. I wonder if you might say a little bit about some of the legislation that's been passed to reduce illegal discrimination against people with disabilities, but we also see that there's still a large unemployment or job shortage there.
Yeah.
Thinking about these two.
Yeah. So this is. So the ADA is the big legal framework, like I said before. I think that is a relatively successful framework for large companies that have the resources to dedicate to managing their hiring practices and managing their institutions. What I heard from people I surveyed, though, is, you know, first of all, businesses less than 15 people don't really have to comply to the ADA. They have an exemption. And when you're dealing in a smaller organization, even if it's above 15 people, it's 50 people, it's really still an interpersonal process. And people with disabilities do get fired, and it's relatively expensive personally to pursue a case over years, even if you can find public free representation or something like that. It's relatively expensive time-wise and energy-wise to try to prove that you were fired for XYZ reason. And I don't think, and we'll look at the data today, there's really a lot of discussion that the ADA was not successful in incorporating people with disabilities in the labor market, that these non-discrimination policies, like, there's a lot of papers saying that it had a negative impact, right? It increases the cost as one, you know, sort of traditional language. It increases the cost for employers to make sure they're complying and that they don't discriminate. There's others that say it had no impact. There's other social things going on, but we'll see. And this is what I have a paper coming out soon about. Is there's been basically a trend since slightly before the ADA of non-participation, and you'll see that clearly in the data today. So yeah, more than non-discrimination is necessary, I would say. But it has been really essential for, especially on the educational front, getting people through high school and even through college and postgraduate degrees. So there are great things about the ADA, but by itself, it's in a workplace environment, it's still sort of a social negotiation with your boss. Yeah.